Welcome everybody, although I can't see you. Throughout the years, I have conducted much research and led research into the relationship between musicians and society, and into musicians engaging with people in new professional practices. The profound question that always arises is, who am I as a musician and how can I contribute to society? As soon as we ask ourselves this fundamental question, it is of importance to first understand ourselves as musicians and grasp our own personal, artistic, and professional identity, which are so highly interrelated. This means that our biographical learning processes are very important. We learn lifelong, from the moment we are born till the moment we leave our lives. And throughout our lives, we learn in different ways. The ways in which we learn determine our motivation, our sense of ownership, and our ability to reflect. Meaningful moments are crucial in this lifelong process. We learn through meaningful moments and occurrences in our lives. And that is life-wide learning, vertically cutting through the axis of our lives. We learn in a holistic way, through our biography, through critical reflection, in and outside our formal educational institution, implicitly and explicitly. H.N. Wenger therefore writes that learning is a lifelong process that is not limited to educational settings, but is limited to the scope of our identities. Who am I as a musician and how can I contribute to society? Every musician plays their role in society, and this is always connected to the social context, no matter whether that is the concert hall, a school, a center for refugees, a hospital, or a home for the elderly. This relates to chamber musicians, orchestral musicians, pedagogues, musicians in the classroom, and those musicians which I call new audience musicians, musicians engaging with others in various community contexts. Musicians can perform their roles in various ways, but at all times there are a few interconnecting factors at stake. The first factor that connects all musicians is the fact that making music and performing music is about an authentic communication between musician and audiences in the most profound sense of the word, no matter the social context. Real Vermittlung, one might say. The second connecting factor is what I call musicians' professional performance. And this is completely interconnected with the first. I would first like to say some more about this second factor, the professional performance. Let us forget for a moment the narrower definition of performance when thinking, for instance, of the performing arts, a dancer, a musician, or an actor on the stage. I would like to discuss a more holistic concept of performance. Erwin Goffman argues that a person's agency in a social situation where they interact with others can be called a performance. That is a simple but complete definition. However, to me, the notion of quality should be added here, where a performance can be considered as the way in which the musician acts professionally in society, with others, including all qualities that go with it. The definition of musician's professional performance, which I propose in the end, is therefore, musician's professional performance is rooted in the connection between one's personal, artistic, and professional development, comprising diverse roles, skills, values, and attitudes, and based upon a profound awareness of one's artistic and professional identity. These interconnected forms of development of which the definition speaks lie at the heart of a musician's learning and developmental processes throughout their life. at the center of which is their biographical learning. The professional performance of musicians is always connected to the social context, no matter which that is. It is, as said, about an honest and authentic communication, about real Vermittlung between the musician and the audience in the most profound sense of the word. The word excellence is strongly connected to a musician's professional performance. And also to that notion, I invite you to look a bit broader. Axel mentioned this yesterday already at the introduction. Obviously, the word excellence makes us think of, first of all, of artistic excellence. And that is without any doubt always a conditio sine qua non. However, if you want to achieve an authentic communication with others, whether that is on stage or in an artistic process with people living with dementia or as a pedagogue, you always need another kind of excellence. And that is what we in our research have termed situational excellence, and which refers to those roles, values, and attitudes which I mentioned in my definition of musicians' professional performance. With values and attitudes, I mean things like authenticity, integrity, modesty, or having an eye for people's dignity. That is all part of the situational excellence of musicians. Those two notions of excellence, artistic and situational excellence, go together and cannot be separated, no matter the social context. I would like to illuminate all of this with two examples taken from a domain in which I've done a lot of research in the last 10 years, that of music and healthcare. We devised, based on research, two artistic projects in healthcare, one in the field of music and dementia and another in the context of music in the hospital. In both cases, this concerns the triangle of patients, musicians, and caregivers. And in both cases, we work mainly with person-centered improvisation. Improvisation as an expression of others and for others. First of all, we researched the practice Music for Life, which is led by Wigmore Hall in London, where a group of 3 musicians engages for a certain period weekly with people with dementia and their caregivers in a residential home. This happens in small workshops where music serves as a kind of catalyst to bring about a deepened communication between everybody involved. All music is made through improvisation, person-centered, where musicians aim to utilize improvisation in a manner that communicates meaningfully with their audiences, with the patients and the caregivers. Person-centered improvisation also acts to engage patients and caregivers in the participatory music-making process. We defined person-centered improvisation as a variety of approaches that seek to tune in to the group in order to create music that authentically reflects the group and its members, with musicians drawing upon a body of shared repertoire developed through a history of mutual engagement and negotiation. The residents and caregivers can join in the music making on little melodic or percussion instruments. The music then emerges through a completely reciprocal process. As a staff member in London expressed it beautifully when he said, "The music is generated by the musicians from the residents." People in the last phase of dementia often do not have many possibilities left to express themselves, least of all verbally. These residents often become livelier and more interested, aware of the people around them and their environment when they engage in the music making. An increase of a sense of well-being can be the result, and it can also happen that through the musical interaction, caregivers see the residents in another light. They see how residents respond to music and become aware that the behavior which they may observe at times is the utterance of a condition and not of the person as such. In other words, an awareness of the person behind the dementia, of a person with a biography, arises through the music. And that is the value of this project. It is impressive to observe, and it remembers us of the words of Oliver Sacks when he wrote, once one has seen such responses, one knows that there is still a self to be called upon, even if music, and only music, can do the calling. In the other project, which is called Meaningful Music in Healthcare, in short, MIMIC, in the hospital, we work a bit different. When we developed this project, we maintained the idea of working with a group of 3 musicians, so a kind of chamber music ensemble. A practice of live, person-centered music making at the sickbed for patient and nurses as a group did not exist yet as such, so the research and development was highly explorative. In MIMIC, we work apart from person-centered improvisation, where musicians make a piece in the moment for a patient or a group of patients, also with repertoire, arrangements, and idiomatic improvisations. Improvisations, for instance, in the style of a certain pop group. We work for 6 or 7 mornings in a row on a particular hospital ward. In both practices, we can ask ourselves the question, what makes these musical artistic processes so unique in the relationship between a musician and their audience, or the communication with the musician and their audience? Music is, as said earlier on, about communication, whether on the stage of a concert hall or at the sickbed in a hospital. If all goes well, something special happens, which is the fact that musicians reach their audiences, making music and performing music in a reciprocal process. You need each other and you give something to each other. I would like to flesh that out by discussing a concept which is key to these 2 practices, which is the quality of the artistic response. I will give an example from the mimic practice. For the interpreter, I give 1 example, not 2, that has to do with the time. This is a story on 2 men on a surgical ward who were both very ill. Mr. A being an older man and Mr. B middle-aged. We visited them 6 days in a row. We were with a cellist, a flautist, and a clarinetist. The patients were in a 2-person room and the curtain between the 2 beds was closed. The men were very ill. Nevertheless, their nurse encouraged us to go in as she felt that music might be beneficial for them. The first time when we came in, Mr. A was asleep and Mr. B was awake. And though he was very weak, he was nevertheless very eager to hear some music. So the cellist played some movements from a Bach suite for him, softly. We had the feeling that the trio of musicians playing would be too much. Mr. B was very happy with the music, and Mr. A, meanwhile, had woken up and expressed his thanks from behind the curtain. The second day was special. Mr. A needed everyday wound treatment, which was a recurring painful procedure for him. His nurses said to us that he had asked for the musicians to play when his wound would be treated. And he had a preference to hear Johann Strauss. So this happened, and Mr. A was happy and distracted. But also the nurses expressed how much more relaxed they were in the wound treatment through the music and through the fact that the patient was distracted and much calmer. On day 3, both patients looked a bit better, and I suggested to open the curtain between them. The musicians then played Queen, I Want to Break Free. The men loved it, And we made jokes about how applicable this text is in a hospital setting. Day 4 was special. The musicians decided to offer to make a piece for the two men in the moment through improvisation, and asked what they would like them to paint musically. A landscape, a feeling or emotion, a color. A color was decided upon. The favorite color of Mr. A was blue and that of Mr. B was green. A beautiful improvisation then emerged, and I, as an observer, heard clearly when the music slowly moved from the color blue to green. But the highlight was to observe the two men. On the moment when the color changed, they turned their faces towards each other and smiled happily to each other, as if they were saying, "Did you also hear this? Here they change from one into another. How beautiful are colors." It was an amazing moment, one of the many wonderful moments that stand out in my memory. So what determines in this little story the quality of the artistic response? First of all, it is of course the use of the person-centered improvisation. Improvisation is not only a means of self-expression, but can also be utilized as an expression for the other, like here, or of the other, like in Music and Dementia. Another aspect is the phenomenon of kairos. Kairos is a conception of time. Kairos is the time in the moment, contrary to chronos, which is clock time. Chronos is lifelong, and chronos is also a day in a hospital with its always recurring interventions. Kairos is the meaningful moment, the vertical moment in the horizontal axis of time in which something meaningful takes place and the time seems to come to a stop. It is, as the Polish poet Wisława Szymborska phrases at the end of her poem, Moment, "This moment reigns as far as the eye can reach, one of those earthly moments invited to linger." Kairos is in the moment where the piece is made for the two men. It has never been before, it will never return. But it is the utterly significant moment where blue goes to green, where everyone recognizes it and enjoys it, patients and musicians, in a completely reciprocal process. The meaningful moment that leads to deep well-being. One of those earthly moments invited to linger. And third, thinking of the quality of the artistic response, excellence is at the core here in a broad sense of meaning. Artistic and situational excellence, the antennae for the social environment, belong together, go together, and are observable here. Here in this example, we see musicians' professional performance in optima forma. In order to exercise our professional performance as musicians, it requires us to constantly resonate with new circumstances and with others. The capacity to resonate with new circumstances and with others can be termed reflexivity. As soon as reflexive processes are given space in musicians, performing music becomes implicitly informed, and musicians' communication can be optimal in relation to any context. In the end, musicians' reflexivity underpins their processes of developing their professional performance. I quote Peter Alheid and myself: "Gaining awareness of who and what I am, of my identity as a musician, is a persistent theme in biographical learning, because the set identity is called into question again and again by external experiences and by inner dialogues in response to them. Reflexivity as a dimension of biographical learning in music thus relates to the unobservable and unmeasurable process by which musical intuition and creativity develop, and which lies at the core of a musician's identity. We can observe reflexive learning processes of musicians, so they're resonating with new circumstances, on 3 levels. The first is the individual level, the micro level of the individual musician. The second is the level of the institution where the musicians engage with, so where the Vermittlung takes place. That institution can be an orchestra, a concert hall, a hospital, a prison, a nursing home. Here, the reflexive processes of change can be observed when bringing in a sustained artistic practice. That is the meso level. The third level is the level of society at large, the macro level. The influence of artistic practices on societal level is much more indirect, but it is there. These 3 levels are highly interconnected. The individual reflexive biographical learning process of the musician has an influence on society. The individual musician can, in the end, influence society. And I'd like to give an example. When the COVID-19 crisis broke out in March 2020 and spread over the world, this had a huge impact. The hospital where we did our research was incredibly challenged. The nurses' workload became very heavy, and nurses worried about the solitude of their patients. Musicians were suddenly out of work. And after a few months, I received a telephone call from a surgeon, one of my colleague researchers in the hospital. She told me that the nursing staff in our well-known surgical ward had asked for the musicians to create a mimic project online. We need our musicians, the nurses had said. And hearing this word "our," my heart made a jump. That meant sheer belonging of the musicians on that ward. It radiated togetherness, a community. The surgeon explained that life at the ward was extremely stressed and that nurses would welcome the musicians to make music for their patients and themselves. Some of the patients came from hundreds of kilometers away in the country, and none of them were allowed any visitors. We immediately adhered to this, developing online mimic projects, where initially we were ambling along without much knowledge nor significant technical possibilities. Musicians had to create a project from their homes, and no more than 2 of them could physically be together in order to appear on the screen with the required distance between them. They were dependent on a good internet connection and on someone in the hospital that would be willing to go with an iPad to patients and nurses. In the end, the musicians created projects where especially couples of nurses and patients enjoyed the music and were moved by it, no matter that it was solely by means of a screen. And after a few of these virtual projects, it was decided by the board of the hospital that the musicians were again welcome to perform live. And that was not because COVID-19 had come to an end, but the board was willing to take a small, well-informed risk, as the well-being of nurses and patients was also very important to them. They meanwhile knew the mimic project and its impact, and they were very much behind this practice. This may seem a nice enough story, but it is a significant story, as it can be considered a recognition of artistic practice on all 3 societal levels. On the micro level are the musicians. They are experienced and skilled and have developed their professional performance in such a way that they can connect meaningfully to the meso level, the institutional level of the hospital and its ward. This has an implicit, indirect influence on the macro level of society at large, which we can see in the decision of the board, which considers that it is not only reducing medical risk that needs to be taken into account. The message the board gives to society is much stronger. It is that music can be considered beneficial for people's well-being and that it can have a positive impact on healthcare at large. Music is considered essential, or to quote Doc Borwick yesterday, indispensable. Such processes are the real key to sustainable practices in a community. Who am I as a musician and how can I contribute to society? As we see, on the one hand, that question must be addressed individually. On the other hand, the musician as an individual can influence society. The musician is in the midst of society and is always connected with the social context, no matter what that context is. That goes for every musician in every professional situation. Making music is about an authentic communication between musician and audience in the concert hall, nursing home, or hospital. It is real Vermittlung. Key is the reciprocity between musicians and audiences, which is brought about by musicians' professional performance. We can even say that musicians' professional performance is by nature underpinned by reciprocal processes. Reciprocity is everywhere. The pedagogue learns from their students also for their own artistic development. Musician learns from the projects in the hospital. How can I transfer this sense of urgency which I feel here to my concerts on stage? One of them wonders. The chamber musician feels connected with their fellow musicians, and through optimal communication with the audience, new things happen in the moment. The music is generated from the residents by the musicians, says the caregiver. Improvisation is the expression of oneself and of the other. These are all reciprocal processes. Convincing high-quality artistic practices in social contexts nurture the personal, professional, and artistic growth of musicians and strengthen their sense of identity. This is not at all about the discourse on music as either l'art pour l'art or social practice. It's about one and the same. And tradition and innovation go hand in hand. Thank you.